Greetings, everyone. This is Ehab Ever, and today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different than what I've done before. I'm going to be doing a book review of a particular text, which is called the Book of Yahweh. Okay, so in this review, I'm going to be going over several topics here. And the first thing is going to be dealing with this particular text. Now, it's claimed to be a translation of the Tanakh, or in English as the Bible. And from there, I'm going to be dealing with the fact that whether this is an accurate translation of anything. I'm also going to be doing an in detailed review of different parts of the book. I won't be going through the full text, for example, but I'll be reviewing it in terms of what it's made of, what is in it, if it's correct, and things like that. And then I'm going to do a summary. Question that many people who've seen my videos may be asking is, why am I reviewing this book? Why, if anything, especially if you look up the history of this particular text. The way it started out was this. I believe that they first came out with this text in 1999, and I think they had previous versions of it or whatever. But the thing is, if you first of all, before I get into like exactly how I entered into this whole situation, you'll notice this book in the current time, which is about 2020 right now, is listed as $669 for this text. Now, when I first reviewed it, it wasn't that much, but essentially what happened was I found out about this text because I had met people who had been fooled by it, and essentially I did a review of it, a written review on Amazon. And I did this review in 2005. Now, one of the challenges back at that time was that there was only a way for me to write things mostly in English. I think when I first wrote the review, they didn't allow like Hebrew text because the computers at the time weren't to the point where they could understand it. And eventually, when they did allow Hebrew text, every once in a while, I noticed that the text would kind of mess up here and there. And I kept saying to myself that there was some way I could really show what I'm trying to describe is how bad this book is and how unworthy of a translation it is. If only I could show that, by some way of like visuals and things like that. And essentially from that point on, when I put the review out, there were people who were supporters of this particular group, the authors of this book, who would like really badmouth me. I think there was even like a 1 to 2 year kind of back and forth in the comment section of my review. And essentially through my review, I detailed exactly what the issues were and what the problems were. And essentially these people kind of came at me. So I decided to kind of decide, at this point, to make a visual review to where you can actually see what I'm going and what I'm talking about. Okay, so first of all, they have gone through a number of iterations of this particular text. They are on their 10th edition, and the thing is, starting from the very first editions that they had to the middle editions to this new ebook edition, essentially, which is their 10th edition, essentially they have failed, and failed to basically tell the truth in terms of what it is that they have what they claim that they've done and claim what this text is. If you see my written review, I give the reasons of why exactly I wrote this review and exactly what the issues are in more detail. But this particular review on the video is going to deal with specifically with some of the points that are harder to show in a written review that would only come out when I do a video review. So just giving you, I guess, a first step into this whole procedure of what we'll be doing in this video. One of the first questions you may be asking is, okay, this BOY, this book that you're talking about is supposed to be a translation. Well, is it an accurate translation? So in order to understand that, let's first look at what they claim the text to be. So looking at the BOY on page 8A, they make a very interesting group of claims here. They start giving some history of the plan of the book, where they start saying, okay, well, this is how they came up with this and that. I mean, it's not very detailed in terms of like exactly the origin of the text, but they do mention something very interesting here. Again, taking into account that they're claiming this is a translation. They say here, which I've highlighted in yellow, is even with these additions, the additions that they made to these various versions, all marginal notes and footnotes contained in the 9th and all previous editions of the book have been retained, including the scriptural explanations as given by 3 important works of reference: the Geneva Bible of 1560 CE, the commentary of the Torah by Rabbi Yitzhak ben Solomon, or Shlomo, who is known as Rashi. And we'll be talking about this in just a second, of how interesting it is that they choose these two, I guess, different texts to be able to like claim the superiority of their translation, which in this next line, they go on. And also, I'm not going to deal with anything dealing with the New Testament. That's something else. I won't be dealing with that. But it says here that all three of these highly respected authoritative works prove over and over that the BOY is the most correct and accurate translation of the Holy Scriptures that is available today. So that's a pretty big claim. And it's interesting that they use the sources that they're using here to claim that this text that they produced is the most accurate text available today. And again, we're going to get into this in just a second, but I want you to note these different claims, and I want you to note especially when they say that it's the most correct and accurate translation of the Holy Scriptures, quote unquote, that is available today. Considering what exactly is an accurate translation. This is, of course, like the first thing that you'd have to wonder, okay, well, what exactly does it mean by accurate? So essentially using definitions that have kind of been placed together by people who deal with translation, a quality translation usually involves the following. Whether it's accurate, meaning it represents the meaning of the source text as faithfully as possible, whether it's natural, it uses the receptor language in ways appropriate to the text being translated, and if it communicates, basically does the expressing the meaning of in an understandable way to the intended audience. A prime example of this when you're dealing with what people would say is the Torah, or even in the Christian Western mindset would be biblical text. One of the things that trips people up a lot is the concept of an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. Well, this brings up a question. Is this something literal or is it figurative? Meaning, is the text saying that literally if someone takes out your eye, you're supposed to take their eye out, and their tooth, if they take your tooth, you're supposed to take their tooth? Is that something literal or figurative? Having the correct text, context, interpretation would be critical to living and dealing with people in a proper manner. So this is where having an accurate translation would be meaningful, or actually would be a requirement in order to do things. Okay, so getting to one of the issues with this particular book, the BOY, is they have a lot of questionable sources in their book. The fact that they're claiming that they use the Geneva Bible as one of their methodologies of proving out that their text is accurate is interesting, given that the BOY has a lot of anti-Christian stuff on their websites as well as in their sources. There's a number of things that they claim about Christianity, but yet they use Christian sources. And the Geneva Bible is a Christian source. That's simply put the history of it. According to the history of it, it basically predated the King James Version and is a Protestant version of the Bible. And I guess they could say that it was a way of getting away from the Catholic version of the Bible. Now, as a Jew, that the Geneva Bible is meaningless. I mean, any translation is meaningless, and I'll get into that in just a second. Now, it's also interesting that they mention in their basic prefix that they use Rashi to try to claim that they, I guess they're using his commentary, or they claim to use his commentary as a way of saying that their text is accurate. Now, as I get to if you look up the history of this organization, you'll find it interesting. And in fact, I find it interesting because in the written book review I did, some of they're in the comment section, for example, there's a number of members of this organization who produced this book who were trying to say bad things about me. And at one point they were claiming all kinds of things about me, claiming that I was what they call me, they said I was a Catholic at one point, they called me a Samaritan at another point, they called me a Pharisee at another point, they basically said lots of bad things about rabbis, about scribes, things like that, but yet they're using Rashi as a way of saying that their text is correct for their commentary. Now, what's interesting is Rashi in his commentary used a lot of Midrashic and Talmudic and Agadah, like literature. So it's interesting that they would go to someone like Rashi to be able to try to prove out their text. It just seems to contradict their idea. And we'll see later how Rashi doesn't support their claim that the use of Rashi makes their text more accurate. Okay, so the first thing we have to deal with is what are the expectations of someone who is a fan of this book, or someone who is a potential customer or has been a customer of this book, the BOY. So one of the things I think that these people expect is that, first of all, there were the scriptures. This nondescript, the scriptures, meaning that basically this is more of a Christian terminology, like the Christian Bible or the Tanakh, but mainly the scriptures. And from there, they believe that the authors of the book, the BOY, essentially took those scriptures and just simply translated, and then you get the book of Yahweh, the BOY. So that's the idea that their fans and their customers have. Now, what's interesting is that when you look at the people who believe this, none of them know Hebrew. So none of them would ever know if this text really was, a translation to begin with. So that's why I can say that, first of all, from experience, and I'll be showing this review, is that this concept is completely wrong. The BOY is not a text that is a translation of any known, Hebrew text, ancient text, anyway. And we'll see that the BOY, the people who authored it, contradict themselves in a number of places, and in fact hold by things that are completely against what they claim that they actually hold by. So, when we deal with this question of the authors of the BOY, did they actually translate something? So essentially, the thing is, if you ask them, I mean, you could send them a message and simply ask them, can you show me the original source text that you go by? And you'll get either or you'll get them saying really bad things about you. From everyone I've ever seen who's ever asked them where their sources are, what source text they use, they will never tell you that, and they'll basically rail on you for even asking the question. And that can even be seen in my written review on Amazon, where the comment section where I asked them over almost a year, when they were going back and forth with me, was like, okay, well, just show your source text, and we'll see, and you'll see that later also. So in order to understand where I'm coming from on this, because I could easily be someone saying saying all kind of things and misleading people, I'm going to provide you with the source material that I'm going to be using in this review and what I shall use on a daily basis to begin with. One of those sources is the fact that in my community, we have a 200-year-old Torah scroll that's from Yemen, and that was brought by the rabbi who used to be part of the community before he passed away a few years ago. He lived until the age of about 94, but he had basically brought this Torah scroll with him, and it's still in my community. So basically, I have access to this text that we use. Also, I have in a digital format a copy of pretty much almost like a 500-year-old Chumash, meaning the 5 books of Moses, that is also from Yemen. That was transcribed by scribes in Yemen, and that's the text I use a lot, predominantly in this particular review. With the exception that I also use basically the Aleppo and the Leningrad codexes whenever possible on the side. So I try to make sure I have a number of sources available to myself to be able to use and review, basically on a daily basis, weekly basis, things like that. So the last relevant text that I use in terms of this discussion is the Samaritan Torah. Now, this is not something that I use for my personal use and study. This, for the most part, I just keep it around. It's something that I can read and I have. And I'll be going into the history of the Samaritans and why it's relevant to this particular discussion about this text, the BOY, that the authors of this text are claiming to be an accurate translation. But essentially, what you see here is that the Samaritans use an ancient form of Hebrew. It's not like the particular script. It's just one of several scripts that at one point was used, and theirs is a very specific text script to their text. But they have a Torah that has about 6,000 differences between their text and the Jewish text, and that's going to become relevant when we have our discussion a little bit later about them in relation to this text that I'm reviewing in this book review. But again, I have access to their text, and this is the myriad of texts that I go through whenever there's an issue or question in terms of the Torah, in terms of any kind of ancient text from this part of the world that I live in, the Middle East. Okay, so let's get into a couple of issues that we have to deal with in terms of, again, going back to how do we define an accurate translation. Professor Leonard Greenspoon, who is the Klutznik Chair of the Jewish Civilization, Professor of Theology at Creighton University, I think described this best when he said, we might go back to the Greek term hermeneo, which means to translate, and it means to interpret. So that translation in and itself is interpretation. This is especially the case when we go, for example, from ancient Hebrew to modern day English, because we've got several thousand years of time that separate the two cultures, and the languages are different in that English is Indo-European and Hebrew is Semitic. He further mentions a question about the status of translations in Judaism, meaning in Torath Moshe as well as Jewish communities, is an interesting one because, for the most part, the translations are intended to complement or accompany the original, but not take their place. There's no synagogue, no matter how reformed, modern, no matter how non-traditional, that doesn't have the scrolls that you know. This is from a verbal discussion he mentioned. Every synagogue has at least one scroll that contains the Torah or the 5 books of Moses. So as far as I know, every synagogue everywhere in the world has that in Hebrew. And when it's taken out and read, it's read in Hebrew. So this is an important part. I mean, he does describe this very well, that pretty much every synagogue you go to, no matter what their particular bent is, no matter whether they reject a number of things here and there, generally speaking, they have at least one Torah scroll that's in Hebrew. And the communities, for example, here in Israel, where Hebrew is like a national language and is spoken every day and studied every day, essentially, there's a number of synagogues here. Most synagogues here, at least, would have like 5 or 6 scrolls in ancient Hebrew that can be read by people. And in my community, for example, everyone who is called to the Torah reads it for themselves, and that's basically the situation as it is educationally. So, in order to basically break down this point of why what I'm going to be mentioning is more reliable than what this group who produced this BOY. Is more accurate, we have to ask the question, well, how did the Jews receive the Torah? Because it was us Jews who received the Torah. Well, as I mentioned in a previous video, there was the singularity. And the singularity is when after a number of events that took place in the land of Egypt that basically brought down the economy of a certain empire, that all of the people who were there, who were called Yisrael or Am Yisrael, they were brought to a particular mountain by a leader named Moshe ben Amram. And when they got to that mountain, which is called Sinai, they were in a situation where the creator of all things started to speak to them in a way that, according to many sources, that he said 10 things. Now, the one source, for example, mentions that he said it all at once, and then he was going through and repeating it, but then people said, well, that's too much. This is too big of a thing, and there was like sensory overload for them. And they asked Moshe ben Amram to basically go up and bring the Torah down to them. Now, the thing is that when the creator of all things spoke these 10 things, there are sources that say that it was as if there was fire in the sky, that the words of the Torah were written in the sky so that people would go back and nobody would be able to come and recreate this. And also in a situation where people would know, okay, we saw that for ourselves. We saw the singularity being we were at Mount Sinai, and then we saw the Torah being written in the air like fire, and we heard the voice of Hashem saying the Torah. And there are some sources that say that the voice of Hashem in this situation was basically as if a million voices were saying the Torah at once. So this is a situation that sets the people of Israel apart from all the nations in the world, that the claim is that the creator of all things spoke to the people of Israel. So after that point, before the death of Moshe ben Amram, he was told by the Creator to write the Torah, write a written Torah, which is almost, if you will, to give it like a kind of a modern understanding, was almost like the Cliff Notes of the revelation that had been given, and of the things of the mitzvot or the commands that he was giving to the people of Israel. So Moshe ben Amram wrote that basically the Torah exactly as the Creator told him to write it, meaning that the words that went into the text, the spacings, the actual letters, the words, how they're supposed to be written, anything that has this letter versus that letter, this word versus that word, all of those things were given and were told to be written in a particular way. Now the thing is, according to Jewish sources and Jewish history, Moshe ben Amram wrote one initial Torah, and then from there he wrote 13 others. And the one Torah that he essentially wrote, the total is 13, that he essentially put one in the Aron HaKodesh, meaning that that's the Ark of the Covenant, as you say it in English. And then from there, he gave a copy of each of one of those copies he made to each of the leaders of the 12 tribes. So from there, you had the main text that was found amongst the Leviim and the Kohanim, the priests and the Levites, basically. And that was kept in the Mishkan, and then eventually it was kept in the Beit HaMikdash, meaning the temple in Jerusalem. And from there, you had those other 12 copies that were made for the different leaders of the Jewish people, of the 12 tribes. And then from there, copies were made of those copies. So what you had is a situation where the one that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote, the first one, would have been considered the master copy. And all the 12 that he wrote would have been also the secondary master copies. And from there, those would be referenced whenever there was a question about what was supposed to be in the text. So essentially what we have is, after more than 3,000 years, amongst both the Jews and also Samaritan communities as well as traditions, you have a situation where every known text today, every known Hebrew text that exists right now, can be traced back to a common source text, being that if you were to go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, whether you would go to the Aleppo Codex, the Leningrad Codex, to various Jewish communities like in Yemen, Europe, Spain, Iraq, Italia, China, if you go to places like and within all these communities, even in a situation where none of them had contact with each other for more than about 2,600 years, what you find is that the transmission of the text is the same. You find that, for example, the rules that were being followed about transcribing it are either exactly the same or about, I would say, 97% similar. And the only major like outliner would be like, for example, the Samaritan Torah, for example. But even with their text, you can see that it has a common structure to it, and that, for example, the changes that they have are just kind of political changes that was made to it. You even find this when you have different items. For example, you have tefillin, which is called in Aramaic, or totafot, or I think in English is called phylacteries, that were found in the Dead Sea. Those texts go back about 2,200 years or so, and they match the text, and they also match tefillin that are used today. When you look at like the actual Dead Sea Scrolls, even those scrolls, as much as people in English, for example, say, well, there's differences, if you look at the differences in Hebrew, they're very minor. They're nothing to where you'd say, oh, this is completely a different text, a different structure, and has different stuff in it. So basically that means that the transmission method used amongst Jews and Samaritans is accurate enough to where a person could look at a text from 2,600 years ago and say, this is the same text, which then means that something that is only several hundred years earlier would have been the same text, because there would have been a situation where there were enough people transcribing it and learning it in the original languages it was in to be able to have a situation where at least one or a few groups would have had it correctly and kept it correctly, even if the majority had fallen off, for example. So looking at this in a little bit more detail, if you look at these different Torah scrolls, you can look at them and tell that when somebody calls them a Torah scroll, you can get an idea that they look exactly the same in terms of their structure. The thing is, if you were to take these different scrolls and read them, you'd find that you're reading the exact same text. And you find that in Jewish communities, there's no such thing as let's take this, translate it, and then never use the original. And let's, like, for example, transcribe it and never tell you where we got the original from. All Jews and even all Samaritans can tell you exactly where the texts are coming from, what the histories are, and give you a chain of transmission that is more than 3,000 years old of how the text came from the time it was given to the Jewish people in the desert before entering the land of Israel until the present day. And that even when Jews were separated by distances, you can look and say that this is the same text, even though, for example, a Jew in China never met a Jew in Yemen. A Jew in Yemen may or may not have met Jews in Iraq, but nobody was willing to give up their own like Torah scroll. But at the same time, when you bring them all together in the land of Israel, you find out that they have pretty much the exact same text. And even when you take the Dead Sea Scrolls, you find out that they're the same. So an obvious question would be, well, how could this be? How could you have several thousand years of people like transcribing something and never like fully changing it to the point where they have the different text? One of the reasons for this is because there have been rules set down amongst Jewish and Israeli communities of how to transcribe a text, exactly who can do it and exactly like when they can do it and how how exactly they're supposed to do it. So it doesn't matter if you're looking at Jews in one area, you see the fact that there are only people who can write a Torah scroll are Jews who are known to keep the Torah correctly themselves. Someone who's known to not keep the Torah correctly is not allowed to make an official Torah scroll. I mean, he may be able to just write one for himself or write one just for the sake of writing it, but it can't be used in an official setting unless you know who transcribed it. So this would be like saying that you have to have a background check on the person before they can even do it. There are certain prayers they have to even say before they start writing. There's even like a situation where they have to immerse themselves in water. Basically come to it with a free mind, and they have to do a practice set before they can even start writing. And this has been the same rules throughout all Jewish communities around the world who have survived until now, and that's why you have a certain accuracy that comes about it, because even if Jews never met each other from different areas, they still came back with the same text. So now let's get into some of the more finer details of why the BOY fails in the areas that the authors try to claim that it passes in, that it is the best in. One of them is dealing with the I guess you could say the issues concerning the name of the creator of all things versus one of the titles Elohim. So that's Yud He Wah He versus Elohim in the documentary theory. Now, this is what I found really interesting when I've looked through this particular book, these authors. On page 6 of the BOY, they make a very interesting claim. And they say here that they have purported in this translation of the, again, quote-unquote, Holy Scriptures, never to stray from the inspiration of the original. Now, this is going to come up. Of what do they mean by all that? We know that each inspired word or phrase has a purpose for all of what they say Yahweh's called out ones. Again, what does that mean? Therefore, they have purported to bring back the original words and phrases to their true meaning if they have been mistranslated. Now, if you look in the next part down, when they basically say about the scriptures themselves, they say in the Hebrew manuscripts, the religious scholars, quote unquote religious scholars, which they don't ever name who they're talking about, conclude that there are three major texts of scripture, the oldest and the original being a Yahwistic work, which the name of Yahweh exclusively, which use the name of Yahweh exclusively. These works are referred to as the J writings because they contain only the name of Yahweh without the pagan titles El, Elohim, Adonai. Now this is their claim. Okay, now we're going to get into that in a little more detail. So they go on and say in these first manuscripts, everyone knew instantly the name of the creator of all things because the minds of those who read it were not confused by reading titles of pagan gods, Elohim. So what they get into is they try to claim something that they don't fully understand or they mistreat or misquote or misrepresent. And in this area, that's something that we need to focus in on. And this is why I want to clue on this area here where they say about this text that they claim to be the J text. Now, what is the relevance of this? What is the significance of this? The significance is this. They are wrong about what they're claiming here. This information that they presented is completely incorrect. Why is that incorrect? What they're trying to describe is something called the documentary theory or the documentary hypothesis. And essentially in 1780, a man by the name of Johann Ichon, building on the work of the French doctor and exegete Jean Astruc conjectures, and others formulated the older documentary hypothesis, the idea that Genesis was composed by combining two identifiable sources, the J source and also the E source. These sources were subsequently found to run through the first 4 books of the Torah, and the number was later expanded to 3 when William D. Witt identified the Deuteronomist as an additional source found only in Deuteronomy. Later still, the Elohist was split into Elohist and priestly sources, increasing the number to 4. So this is what they're trying to reference, but if you notice the difference between their wording and the actual wording about the particular theory, their wording is not the same. There is a complete difference between what they're talking about. And if you look in like the Amazon review I did, they try to misrepresent what the Johann Ichon was even like dealing with, what he was claiming. And we'll get into why his theory is even wrong and why the documentary hypothesis is wrong. And here's what needs to be represented correctly. Essentially speaking, what this is saying is that parts of Genesis were from a priestly source or E source, and parts of Genesis were from a J source. That's the claim of this particular individual, like back in the 1700s. This claim was basically saying is that, okay, look, only parts of this of Genesis or Bereshit represent the J text, and only parts of it represent the E text or the priestly text. So he was never claiming that, for example, there was an independent text, separate, that had everything in it, and there was another text that had everything in it separately. And we'll get into that in just. So the claim being made by the authors of the BOY is essentially this, and this is also by the people who I consider to be like their fans, for example. Their basic claim is that there was this Y text that was a complete text from, if you will, Bereshit all the way to Devarim, and for those English speakers out there, from Genesis all the way to Deuteronomy. It was completely there, and it only had Y material, that it was basically the name of the creator of Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh all over the place, only that name in there. No, like Elohim didn't show up in it, El didn't show up in it, Elonai didn't show up in it, only the name of Hashem written as Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh showed up in it. And that there was eventually created a separate text that had E elements added to it, so essentially that some mysterious person out there, some mysterious Jew somehow took the text and said, okay, I want to add some pagan titles in here somewhere. I just have to have them in there. I won't do it completely. I'll just do it partially. And essentially that was what created the 2 different texts, and that they basically said that this Y text was the original and that this E text was what was created. Now, that's where they get into this idea that they represent the Y text and that everyone else is representing this E text. It together of what they're saying and just kind of reviewing it again so we understand completely what their claim is. That basically what happened was somebody took these 2 texts, spun them around, and then eventually came up with a Torah that had Elohim and Adonai in it, as well as El, and altered the name of the creator of Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh in some places, and essentially kept it in some places, altered it in other places, just for the sake of adding pagan titles for some unknown reason. Now, we know that this is completely wrong, and we'll get into more details of why this is wrong in just a second. So it's important to note that this is different than what the documentary theory or the documentary hypothesis is. So at a glance, this is what the documentary theory is saying as we described it earlier. Essentially, they say that there was this Y text that was a fragmented text, meaning that not all of the Torah was there, not the 5 books. It was just parts of different books and not including certain books altogether. So anything dealing with priestly stuff, that wasn't in this book. That's the Y text, if you will. They say that that was like represented in only parts of Bereshit, parts of Genesis, maybe all of Exodus, Shemot, but not the priestly text, not anything with Deuteronomy. They say then there was an alternate text that was an E text that, for example, only dealt with certain parts of Genesis, certain parts of Exodus, of Shemot, and had like some of the priestly stuff in it, but not all of it. And then they say, okay, well, there was various Deuteronomy histories that were out there. So all of the things in Deuteronomy or Devarim or came about later, and that this was also separate. And then that there was also the priestly information, so that the priest, for example, had this other text that was out there. And that all of those texts got combined together to make the one current Torah text. So this is the claim of the documentary theory and hypothesis, but here's the issue with this. This is also wrong, and we'll get into why it's wrong. And I've already explained part of it earlier when I explained how Jews got to the current text that we have right now. Now, an additional piece of information to the documentary theory or documentary hypothesis is that one important claim of it is that the E text, according to this theory, is originally from northern Israel, that it came from the split that took place between the lower kingdom of Judah and the upper kingdom of Israel, where 10 of the tribes went to the north and like formed their own kingdom there, separated themselves from the kingdom of Judah, and in the south, that's where they believe the J text came from. So again, the claim here that the hypothesis makes is that the E text came from the north, which had Elohim in it, which also was a priestly text, and that the Y and J text came from the south, which had Yud He Wah He in it, the name of the Creator in it. The important problem with this aspect of the theory, of the documentary theory, or the documentary hypothesis, is the existence of the Samaritan or Shomoroni people that exist today in the north of Israel, basically in the area called the West Bank nowadays. There live about 500 members of this group called the Samaritans or the Shomronim. Half of them live in Israel in a place called Holon, and half of them live in the Palestinian region of the West Bank, or the so-called Palestinian region of the West Bank. Now, the significance of this group is that they come from a place called Shechem. When Shechem is basically an area in modern times is called Nablus in the Arab region. Now, they are the best representatives in the modern day of the descendants of the Israelites or the Israelis who lived in the north, a part of the kingdom of Israel, that northern kingdom that broke away, and that, according to the documentary theory, are the originators of the E text. Now, the thing about this is that according to this theory, they basically say that the E text would have Elohim in it, but not, the name of Hashem, Yud He Wah He, so that wouldn't exist in the text. Now, what's important to note is that if you look at a modern Samaritan text, you would supposedly, think that the Elohim would show up more than the name of Hashem in it, the name of the Creator of all things. But if you look in their modern text, you'll find that Yud He Wah He shows up in it more than Elohim. So basically, if you look in this text here, which is a part of a Chumash or the 5 books of Moses that they use, there it is there. If you look at a Torah scroll of theirs, similar to the one that's on the right, you see it there. I looked at a couple of them, you see the name of the Creator of all things in there. You would expect, supposedly, that Elohim would be there and not the name of the Creator. So what this basically means is, if you're trying to understand what the equivalent is, this right here on the right, which is in red, is what they write. This is their form of Hebrew, which they have their own particular script of Hebrew. That's what you see there. And the equivalent, of course, is what you see on the left there, in the name of the Creator, which shows up in Jewish text. Now, again, the documentary theory claims that, for the Samaritans at least, Elohim, or Elohim, would show up in it more, or completely show up in the text rather than the name of the Creator, Yod He Wah He. But what you find is actually that this is wrong. Modern day Samaritans, when you look in their Torah texts, which I have a copy here in where I live, is that what you actually find in the reality is that Elohim for them, shows them in it less than the name of the Creator. So essentially, the name of the creator shows up in their text more. This means the documentary theory is incorrect. And the reason, of course, as we mentioned before, is that the author of the documentary text didn't have access to ancient Jewish texts. He didn't have access to like ancient Samaritan texts or even modern Samaritan texts. He wasn't taking those things into account. And again, he was forming a theory. He wasn't forming something where he looked at all the ancient Jewish texts that existed and said, okay, I've read it all in Hebrew, and this is my findings. Basically, what he was saying was, okay, well, this theory, I believe that it's, this shows up here for this reason, and only parts of the Torah are like this and that. He's not saying that the whole thing was. And that's an important aspect of this particular claim, that the authors of the BOY were trying to portray it as basically that there was a complete text that only had Yud He Wah He in it, and then like there was a complete text somewhere else that had Elohim or El Adonai in it. And we're going to see further and further that this is wrong, and we're going to see how they even contradict themselves pretty soon. Essentially, what this means is that the authors of the BOY, looking at their, I guess you could say, chapters of what they consider to be their so-called translation, going from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, Bereshit, basically Shemot, Vayikra, and also Bemidbar and Devarim. This chronological order that they presented in terms of the Torah, according to the documentary theory, or the hypothesis which they are trying to partially use, this means that their particular order here is wrong. And again, the reason is because of the fact that the documentary theory claims that there was no complete text that had like one name in it versus another, that only there was like fragments of the text that got put together in one text. Okay, so now let's get into what I would call the BOY fail number 2. And that's the BOY and their problem with the title Elohim. So if you go to the preface of their particular book of the authors of the BOY, you look at what they described as the problem. In the preface 1a and also in 4a, you get this description here. And essentially what this is telling you is that at some point, which they don't describe in detail of like who, when, where, what, and why, they claim that, for example, that some unknown author came in and essentially like changed the text of I guess you could say what they would call the Bible of several thousand years ago, and then essentially inserted the names of Elohim, El, and Adonai into the text, and replaced the creator's name Yud He Wah He with essentially just going in and replacing it for some unknown reason, which, as we'll see, doesn't make a lot of sense, especially since there would be no way for such a person to go in there and change it in everybody's text, because this person would have to convince every single Israeli in every single location all around the world that existed in Israel and outside of Israel to change their text along with them. And you'll see that this is a major claim they make. But we're going to see pretty soon that their claim doesn't match up with history. It doesn't match up with any known Hebrew documents out there. And it's a rule they don't even follow themselves. We'll see that just a bit. But in order to preface this, let's deal with this issue and see how they're wrong. Again, my important reason for doing this video is to show you how they're wrong and not just simply say they're wrong. So literally starting at the beginning of this book, in terms of the actual text itself, on page 1 of the BOY, they make a very interesting claim within the first sentence of their particular so-called translation. They claim that the original text is in the beginning, and then it has the name Yud He Wah He in it, and then so on and so on. So the problem is that, again, let's look at what an ancient text, an ancient Torah text actually has in it. So this right here is a 500-year-old Torah text that comes from Yemen, from the Jews of Yemen, which is an important thing because of the fact that Jews from Yemen, according to the history, were separated from the people, the rest of Israel during the time of the First Temple. That about 80 years before the First Temple was destroyed, there were a group of Jews who left there because they knew that something was bad was about to happen. They left and went into Arabia and stayed there. So if you look at this 500-year-old text, which is copied from a text that was like several hundred years older than it, and so on and so on, it says the following: Bereshit, which is in the red, Boro Elohim. So we notice that the name Yud He Wah He does not show up in this ancient text, and we'll go a little bit further with that in just a second. So literally translating it, it basically has Bereshit, in a beginning, or depending on, we'll get into some of this issue also. Boro, he created, Elohim, so meaning Elohim, and we'll get into what that means exactly. So a translation for kind of modern English is like basically saying, in a beginning, Elohim created, so he created something. Now, they could easily say, well, this is like some Jewish text, which they sometimes do. They say, okay, well, the Jews just made this text up and like inserted that in there. Well, let's look at a Dead Sea Scroll that's more than about 2,200 years old. And what does it have inside? It has Elohim, and it has Elohim again. So this is also Bereshit, and this is Elohim here, as you see, Aleph Lamed He Yud Mem Sofit. Okay, so let's get into another issue that we have here. Remember how we mentioned earlier that they were claiming that they use Rashi as a reference and that Rashi supports their translation as being the most accurate? Well, let's look what Rashi says for this comparison of page 1 of the BOY concerning when it says in the beginning, and they say that it's supposed to have Yud He Wah He in it, the name of the Creator. Rashi mentioned something of the following. She says, like, he asked this question, Bara Elohim. Velo Amar Bara, Yod He Wah He, for example. So he says, Shepetachala ala b'machshava leberoto b'midat hadin, ra'eh she'en ha'olam mitkayem, hakdim midat rachamim v'shatafa lemidat hadin. Hayinu dichtiv lehalan bet dalet b'yom asot al Hashem or Elohim eretz v'shamayim. So essentially what Rashi is explaining here is that he's asking the question, why does it say Elohim versus like Yod He Wah He? And he says that it is for a purpose that it's there. Because the basic issue is that the Creator wanted to first establish the universe based on laws of judgment, and then decided basically to have mercy, so that the name of the Creator of Yod He Wah He is considered to be that of mercy, where the term Elohim represents judgment. So that essentially what you have is that you have mercy before judgment. So the basic issue is that Rashi supports the idea that Elohim is the correct term that's supposed to be there. So he does not support this idea that they have that Yod He Wah He was there. So it was interesting that on the first page, Rashi doesn't support them, and Rashi essentially would be saying this is not accurate. So we know that this would be wrong based on this group. So now let's get to understand the word Elohim and what seems to be the basic problem that the authors of the BOY have against it in order to understand where they basically falter in this area. So the first thing we want to understand is what is the word. So looking at it, what you see flashing now is the word Elohim. And in the Samaritan language, it's pronounced Elohim. So the thing that's important to note here is that Hebrew is read and written from right to left. That would mean that we pronounce this in this way, Elohim, or in the Shomroni or Samaritan, Elohim. So why is this important? That we're trying to understand exactly how we're pronouncing things. First of all, like I said before, in the Torah Moshe text, it's Elohim, and then the Samaritan's Elohim. So the interesting thing here and the important thing here to remember is that Hebrew works upon three-letter roots. The way you form words in ancient Hebrew is by having three-letter roots that form the verbs and form some of the nouns that you have. So the basic root of Elohim is Aleph, Vav, Lamed, in ancient Hebrew, Aleph, Wav, Lamed. Now, that's again from right to left, Aleph, Wav, Lamed. Now the other thing here is the same root, Aleph, Wav, Lamed, is the same root as Aleph, Yud, Lamed. So these two roots are essentially the same root. They're considered to be essentially the same, and we'll show you that from a lexicon in just a second to explain it. Now, the other thing that's important to note is that Elohim by itself, as a term, is considered to come from the shoresh, the three-letter root, Aleph, Lamed, He. So essentially, the basic meaning of all three of these words is like strength and power. That is the essential meaning of them. They don't mean deity. They don't mean God. They just simply mean strength and power. It's in the English that people like associate English terms with what these meanings are. But essentially, the basic meaning of the words of the three-letter roots is strength and power. So this will be important in just a second when we deal with some of the problems that the authors of the BOY have. So let's deal with fail number 3 of the BOY. The BOY authors are just making it up as they go. So to explain this, let's look at page 28 of the BOY, where they have this term where they say that this term is Ra and then YL. So the first question you have to have is, okay, I know what they're trying to say. I know they're trying to say Yisrael or Yisrael, but the thing is, how do you pronounce YL in English? Now, I asked a couple of people this, and everybody kind of gave me this weird answer, and nobody could really answer it completely. And when you ask the people who are involved in this group who produced this book, they don't even fully answer it. Now, here's the reason why the problem comes up. The first problem, like I mentioned before, is how do you pronounce YL in English? So why would you write YL if you can't really pronounce it? The other question is, how would you spell Israel YL and Yisra YL in Hebrew. So I came up with a couple ideas because initially at the time I couldn't figure out how they were coming up with this because they don't explain it in their book and they don't show you very much Hebrew in their book or any really at all. So I said maybe the way they're trying to say that this is pronounced is this term Yisra YL is maybe like Yud, Sin, Resh, Yud, Lamed. The Yud and the Lamed are in red, meaning the YL. So what you see in red, the Yud and the Lamed, again going from right to left, is the way I thought maybe they were representing YL. Now the first problem with this is this doesn't make any sense. There's no such word like this. And as a term, it doesn't make any sense. And we'll get to see why it doesn't make sense a little bit later. But the next thing I came up with, I said, well, maybe they're trying to say it's like Yisrael pronounced this way, or Yisrael. Because I couldn't understand how they were trying to write this out. And the reason why I came up with this is, and again, this is a problem also, is because of the root Aleph Yud Lamed. That's the only way I could see them coming up with this YL idea, simply because of the way they're spelling it of YISRA than YL. So I figured that the AYL was their attempt at saying Aleph Yud Lamed, going from right to left again. Now this was the initial theory I had. And interestingly enough, this leads into this next part. So they claim that Israel, or this term Yisra YL, means struggler of Yahweh by Yahweh's side, or ruler as Yahweh would rule. Okay, well here's the basic problem with that. Yisrael, or Yisra YL, and Yisra YL cannot mean struggler of Yahweh's side or ruler of Yahweh, or as Yahweh would rule, because the name of the Creator, Yud-Wah-He, is not in that word at all, or the short version of Yud-He is not in that word at all. So, for example, this word here, the way I would attempt to believe that they were producing it initially was in this form. They expect, again using Aleph Yud Lamed. The expectation you would have is that they would be spelling it and pronouncing it as Yisraya, meaning that Yud, Sin, Resh, Yud, He, the Yud and the He being in red. If this is what they're saying that Yisra means, struggler by Yahweh's side, or ruler as Yahweh would rule, you would expect that this second term that just popped up on the left side is the way that they would be writing it, rather than something else with YL, for example. Now, again, keep your eyes focused on this, because this was my initial guess. Now, this is, I guess, the author of this book, and you'll notice that he's standing behind a podium. This is a video that showed up on YouTube of them, and you'll notice what's written here. You'll see that it's the same thing I wrote earlier as my guess of what they were using. And I found this out after I'd already put most of this presentation together. So the important thing is saying that this word here is written the way that they had it on that podium. So again, remember I asked you, how would you spell Yisra YL or Yisra YL in Hebrew? This is the way they're spelling it. So you see that they have the English word above it and they have the Hebrew word below it. So notice this again. Remember how I talked about the three-letter roots of Hebrew, that it uses three-letter roots to form words? So you notice that they have at the end of this word Aleph Yud Lamed. So the root, remember I mentioned earlier of Elohim is Aleph Waw Lamed or Aleph Yud Lamed. So what we're seeing here is that El and YL or IL, depending on how you want to try to pronounce it, are the exact same word. So this means that the authors of the BOY are using the term Elohim, and that they have no problem with it, even though on the same side of it, they claim that it's a pagan term. They claim El is a pagan term, they claim Elohim is a pagan term, but they're using it. They're just simply pulling the wool over people's eyes because they know that the people who would buy this book don't read Hebrew and would never check into something like this. So how do you know that I'm telling the truth on this? Well, let's look at what's a lexicon called the Analytical Hebrew and Chaldee Lexicon by author named Davidson. On page 12, look at what he notes. He says that Aleph, Waw, Lamed, and Aleph, Yud, Lamed, which the Aleph, Yud, Lamed on the kind of right side there, inside this red box, you saw that they had that in that little name there for the of Yisrael. So you notice that he says here that the Aleph Yud Lamed, for example, is a certain ornament over doors and windows, meaning like a ram. And also he says also like a deer, depending on ayal. That's like one of the words used in modern Hebrew to describe a deer or ram. Now the thing that's interesting here is, remember how they had Aleph Yud Lamed again, and that means mighty or noble. Now there was a house of Yahweh member that once tried to claim that this wasn't correct, that it doesn't mean this, but I told them, I was like, yes it does, and they of course didn't know this source. But you'll also notice that the same way that these roots are describing Aleph Yud Lamed, it also is the same, the shortish or the same three-letter root for the term El meaning strong or mighty, which is a term that the authors of the book BOY claim is a pagan term, but yet it's the same word as the one that they're using in this section here that you see, Aleph Yud Lamed. So this again proves that they're using terms that they claim are pagan, but they're also using those terms. They're just simply pulling the wool over people's eyes with this stuff. So let's do the same process, taking also from another page of this lexicon. Essentially, we see that the term, remember I mentioned earlier, the Aleph Lamed, excuse me, hey, and that basically is the root of the word Elohim. Now the thing is, if you notice in this, you can kind of read this on your own of what the term is, and also you'll notice that it tells you that it's the same root or the same, it's connected and related to the term of the three-letter root Aleph Vav Lamed, which also, as we know, is related to Aleph Yud Lamed. So this means that this part of the Yisrael that is on their official banner, I guess, at their site, is using a term that they claim is pagan. They claim that Aleph Yud Lamed is pagan, and they also claim that the other ones are pagan, but they're actually using it. So again, remember how I told you about those related roots, that Aleph Vav Lamed and Aleph Yud Lamed and Aleph Lamed Hey are all related? Well, this lexicon proves it. Now, you may say to yourself, well, that doesn't prove anything. The authors of the BOY don't use that lexicon. They don't agree with that lexicon. Well, on page 1 of their 10th edition, which is their latest edition, you'll notice right there on the right side in red, it contradicts them. They use that particular lexicon. They're using it in their text. And I found that they use it about 55 times in their last edition, which is the 10th edition. So essentially, I plan on having a little bit more to this. And just for the sake of time, I'm going to shorten it. But on page 28 again, this is what they provide. And then if you look at like different histories of Semitic or Middle Eastern terminology, you'll find that they're basically using the same terms that they claim are pagan. That essentially by writing YL, they're trying to somehow separate themselves out and make it seem as if they're doing something new or different or something that's ancient that everyone else is not doing. But if you look into it, you'll find that no matter how you spell it, EL, YL, it's all the same word. It's basically El. El is the same term. And in ancient times, the term itself just meant strength or power. It didn't mean deity or like God. At some point, there are people who decided to make it into a specific term, but in ancient times, it just meant strength or power. Okay, now this part I found really interesting because here on page 2A of the BOY, they make this claim about, again, to try to pump up their claims of them using the correct name of the creator. Now they say something really interesting in the last paragraph when it says the ancient honor name. It says it was 3 years after its discovery before this fragile amulet could be unrolled by technical experts at the Israel Museum. That's right here. Now look at how they spell this name of this museum. Now, here's the thing. I live in Israel. So I actually live in Jerusalem, and I live not that far away from this museum that they're trying to supposedly claim. This is the front of that museum. And if you look here, how is it spelled? The name of the museum? So look at the authors of the BOY. Look at how they spell it. Look at how the museum is actually spelled. So they're already changing things in order to try to fit their terminology. But look even closer here. This is the name of the museum in Hebrew. It says Museum Yisrael. Now, just to get a closer look, that's how Yisrael is spelled. Now, you notice that that's not much different than what they've been using to spell when they added like a yud in there between the aleph and the lamed. So as you can see, they consider this term to be the exact same term as what they're using, because if they wouldn't have like written it that way in the book and said that this museum is named the ISRAYL Museum. So they're basically saying the same thing. And if you look at this video, it's called like Yahweh is Not God, The Temples of Rome, Mystery Babylon, at about about 12 seconds to 17 seconds in the video, I guess the main author of this book is actually called out by name, and his name is pronounced exactly as Yisrael. I mean, the guy is pronouncing it the exact same way you pronounce Yisrael, which means that they use a term that they consider to be pagan, which the term is really not pagan. It's just a term, but they consider to be pagan, and they're going against their own word on it. So now we can get into some actual translation fails. We did a lot of failures in terms of how they present their book and the background of it, but now let's get into actual places where they mistranslate things. So on page 1 of the BOY, they say that basically that everything was created and they with the creation story, for example, and they mention here in their translation in the evening and then the morning and the evening and then the morning were the first day. Well, this is wrong. because if you look at ancient texts, it doesn't say basically first day. The actual the way it's written in Hebrew is Yom Echad, and Yom Echad it means day one. So the way, if you look at it, like what I have on the right side, and this is from an ancient Hebrew text, that essentially it says the way that the creation story goes is day one, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, seventh day. So basically all the other terms used for every other day are like second, third, fourth, fifth, where the first one is mentioned as day one. And the BOY, of course, translates this incorrectly because it isn't first day, it's day one. So this is an incorrect translation, which would mean they're not an accurate translation. And this can even be found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you see there at the bottom where it says Yom Echad, which means day one. Okay, now what's the explanation of this? Why is this even important? In terms of the Masorah, meaning the transmission of information that Jews have received from the time of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, is that on day one, it was distinct from all the other days of creation because the concept of time hadn't been created yet. And that's why it's denoted as day one versus the rest are second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, seventh day. So that's the importance of that. Now, another pretty simple translation issue here is where they mention on the BOY of page 4, and this is Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, where they write, and Abram was faithful in all of Yahweh's house, and Yahweh accounted it to him as righteousness. Well, that's not correct. Okay, so if you look at an ancient text of the Torah for the same area, this is the section that they're supposedly trying to translate, and what it reads is, Waha'amin b'Adonai, v'yichashavahu lo tzadago. Okay, so essentially taking this bit by bit. Waha'amin. So what does that mean? The root of this word means to trust in something that has been established itself by proof. It's a word that doesn't mean belief or faith. It doesn't mean you believing in something. It is also talking about how Avram felt towards the creator of all things, meaning that this is the way Avraham felt. This is not the way he was considered by the creator. The other issue here is that this little symbol here that's surrounded in blue, that is called Athnoho. And it's similar to a semicolon. And if you look in the BOY, they don't put a semicolon there. I think they put like a comma, which is incorrect. The next thing here is the word sadako at the end of the statement. The root of this word is tzadi dalet kuf, which means just to correct. And again, it's based on a proven record. So as we can see, a correct translation of this would be based on the Hebrew itself. And he, meaning Avram or Avraham, trusted in what the Creator, Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh, had just promised to him in the previous verses, based on Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh's proven record of trust. And he, Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh, meaning the Creator of all things, considered to him, Avram, to be justness or correctness. I mean, again, this is, you have to wordsmith it a bit, but they're wordsmithing it in a way that's different than the text actually says. Now, in the BOY in Exodus 6:7, which is on page 47, they make this statement where it says, "I will take you as my people, and I will be your heavenly Father." So the issue here is they inserted that statement on their own, because that's not correct either. Because as you see, the term is Lelohim. So basically what it's saying is that I will take you as my people, and I will be your Elohim, meaning your mighty one or your strong one. Because again, we explored what the meaning of this term Elohim is, and we also explored that the authors of the BOY, as much as they talk bad about it, they actually use the actual term quite often. So the next thing in their translation issues is on page 49 in Exodus 7:1. They try to translate this as, "Behold, I've made you as a mighty one." Now, again, how do you write this in Hebrew? They, of course, won't tell you that, and their note doesn't mention anything about it. The thing is that, again, the term used here is Elohim, because the word Elohim does not mean God or deity. It means strength or power, as we saw from the lexicon that they even use. So again, we see another translation issue where they're mistranslating it or trying to pretend that they're not using terminology that is actually there. So again, one of the things I suggest is just getting into, you can go on and on with this part of it, is ask if you're so interested in this book, which if you are, that's up to you. You need to ask them what were the sources that they translated from. So another fail of them is that they, as much as they are supposedly against using pagan names and terms, besides the Elohim issue, they do use a lot of pagan terms. They use terms in English that they don't realize are pagan potentially, or that they just kind of ignore in order to push their agenda. So one example of this is in the BOY on page 4, Genesis chapter 6. It says, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and the son was named Seth." Now, here's the first problem. The term Seth is the name of an Egyptian deity. It's an Egyptian god whose name is Seth, as you can see from the Encyclopedia Britannica. So in the original Hebrew text, the name of the son of Adam and his wife was Sheth. Sheth is, of course, not Seth. So Sheth is how you pronounce it in Hebrew, as you can see here. And basically, they also, the other issue is in yellow, they added Yod Waheh, basically in a place where it doesn't show up again because they try to claim Elohim is pagan, but yet they are willing to use the name Seth, which is definitely a pagan deity, where instead of writing it as Sheth, Sheth would have been spelled potentially in English as Sheyth. But it's interesting that in the 10th edition, they still haven't corrected that. And I brought this up years before their 10th edition, and they haven't corrected it at all. And I find that really interesting. So again, if you're so interested in this book, ask them, show you the text, show the actual text that they translated from. Don't just tell you about it, show it to you. They keep saying, well, they use the Holy Scriptures, or they translated from the Holy Scriptures. Well, show them, ask them to prove it to you. Now, the next fail is that, this whole claim of the name of the Creator is hidden away somewhere. Okay, well, it doesn't take much to prove that the name of the Creator hasn't been hidden. I mean, especially for people who know Hebrew and people who are really searching for it, if you will. It's not hidden. I mean, it's always there. So again, remember how they made this claim, which we've kind of debunked, and they talk about this amulet, for example, which I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to show off to their fans, look, there's this amulet that you didn't know about that has the name of the Creator on it. Okay, we all know about that. It's right there. I mean, it's not hidden anywhere. The name of the Creator is written right there. You just have to know Hebrew to learn it, to read it. And anyone who knows Hebrew could actually read it right there. In the same way that this is like, for example, from a Jewish Torah scroll that's found in Jewish synagogues everywhere. And the name of the Creator is there. The name of the Creator is there. The name of the Creator is there. It's there also. So nobody's hiding the name of the Creator there. Now, the name's not so hidden. Again, we looked at this before. That's the name of the Creator. Well, here it is in a Torah scroll that shows up in a Jewish synagogue. And essentially every Jewish synagogue has Torah scrolls written in Hebrew. So the name of the Creator shows up there. This is a Dead Sea Scroll. Well, there's also the name of the Creator there. And that's not being hidden. I can go to the museum here in Israel and in Jerusalem and go find this there. This is a Samaritan Torah, the same group of people that the documentary theory claims had Elohim and not the name of the Creator in it. Well, there it is right there. And this is an ancient text of theirs, maybe like 1,000 years old, I think. This is a modern day Samaritan text that I have at home. Oh, there it is right there. So again, in order to deal with this responsibly, you would have to ask them what their translation sources were, which they, of course, will give you. Because the thing is, about 4 years ago, and meaning that right now it's 2020, 4 years ago from here, I asked them about this. This is one of the comments I made when they were criticizing my review of their book, which is interesting that somebody criticizes your review of a book. If it's their book, it should stand up to criticism, and that's what Amazon lets you do. So if you notice here what I mentioned, and first thing I asked them, this particular person I was responding to, whose name was Yochanan A. Hawkins, I said, okay, where did you translate from? It should be easy for you to tell me what you translated from. And they had gone through a lot of name calling. They called me a Catholic at one point. They called me a Samaritan. They called me a Pharisee, which it was interesting by itself. But his response was this long response here, where he's basically telling me he won't tell me what their source of information came from or what they translated from. Because of course we already know that they didn't translate. They probably just took like an existing Bible and reworked it, and maybe it was the Geneva Bible that they mentioned. They just reworked it and went forward from there. So you can find these responses going on the Amazon review that I mentioned earlier to their previous editions, the one that's like now $600 or something in price. And you'll notice that he doesn't respond to the actual question of what did they translate from. And it should be easy. If they translate, they should be easy to tell you that it's manuscript number such and such found in this part of the world. And this is what we translated from, and this is our accurate text, and it's over this many years old, and so on and so on. So I could go on for days with this whole thing. I could just go on and on, literally going page by page, going through the different mistakes in translation, errors in translation, as well as the things that they're just making up on the fly. But of course, I mean, they would take a lot longer video than this video already is long enough. So that's, like I said, there are various versions, all the way up into this 10th version, fail. I mean, it's not a translation of anything. It's not an accurate text. And they don't represent the things that they claim they represent. We've already shown how basically it's not a reliable text. We showed that it's not a translation of any text. And it would be better for you to avoid this book altogether. And the suggestion I make, I mean, please hear me out on this. I suggest that you just simply do the work and get yourself a Hebrew text. You'll get a lot more out of that. And Hebrew is actually not a hard language to learn. It's actually more structured than English. So if you're listening to me, The thing is, if you really want to have an accurate text, for those of you who are so interested in a book like this, who are looking for like certain terms or names to show up in your English translation, well, those of us who can read Hebrew, we don't have to worry about that. We can just read the stuff in the language it was written in thousands of years ago, and we still know it today. And there's a lot of resources out there on how to learn a Hebrew text. And you can even, at the bare minimum, get a text that has Hebrew on the right side and English on the left side. And even if you don't like the terms in the English, you can look at the Hebrew. It's right there. But my suggestion to people who are so interested is you can spend your money and your time more reliably in the Hebrew text. So this is a Havever from the Chronicles of a Havever. I'm sorry for the length of this, but I just had to go into detail on this. And I hope that for those of you who are interested in this kind of stuff, that it helps you out and that you can make better decisions from it. So take care.